Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Robert Litvak, Vice President for Programs at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'd like to welcome you to today's meeting, focus of which is on the United Nations Human Rights Council, assessing the U.S. policy of engagement. The United Nations Human Rights Council, an intergovernmental body made up of 47 states, is responsible for the promotion and protection of human rights around the globe. It was created in 2006 to replace the Commission on Human Rights. In July 2009, the United States joined the Council with the goal of strengthening the body's capacity to address crisis situations as well as chronic human rights violations worldwide. We're fortunate today to have a panel of experts with us who will assess U.S. policy of active engagement at the Council from a variety of perspectives. Has membership made the Council more effective? Should the United States seek a second term on the Council? Speakers will address whether or not engagement has sufficiently advanced U.S. interests and values. Our speakers today are Morton Halperin of the Open Society Foundations, Brett Schaefer of the Heritage Foundation, Paula Schrieffer of the Freedom House, and Ruth Redwood of Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. At the Center, we're appreciative of the collaboration with the Open Society Foundations and their support of this meeting. I'd like to particularly thank Allison Garland, a program associate at the Center, for her pivotal role in organizing today's event. Each of our speakers will lead off with brief opening remarks to frame their views on this question. Then we'll open it up for comments and questions from the floor. Our first speaker will be Morton Halperin, senior. There are bios outside the room, but for those watching on webcast, let me give you the full introduction of our speakers. He's a senior advisor to the Open Society Foundations and the Open Society Policy Center. He served in the Clinton, Nixon, and Johnson administrations, most recently as Director of Policy Planning at the State Department in the latter part of the Clinton administration. He taught at Harvard, as well as at other universities. He's been affiliated with a number of think tanks, including the Center for American Progress, Council on Foreign Relations, Carnegie Endowment, the Century Foundation, Brookings. Author of numerous books, which include Bureaucratic Politics and Foreign Policy, The Democracy Advantage, and Protecting Democracy. So, Mort, thank you for joining us.
I think actually the only one I haven't been at is the Woodrow Wilson Center, so put that on your list.
We could perhaps rectify that.
I think the place to start in discussing the Human Rights Council and the U.S. engagement with it is with the question of whether there is an alternative, because I think almost all of us believe that there needs to be some place that people struggling for democracy, struggling for their human rights, and being oppressed by their leaders can go and seek support, seek pressure on their government to stop the oppression. And I want to argue that there is no alternative to the UN Human Rights Council. First of all, it will be there whether or not the United States walks away. And we saw that when the Bush administration decided not to seek election to the Council. The Council did not stop. It continued to function, and it functioned very badly. And the excessive pressure on Israel, which continues, and I think is something we need to work very hard to try to stop, continued and got much worse with the U.S. absence. We were left with the Canadians trying to defend the Israelis there on their own but not members. So there is going to be a Human Rights Council, whether the United States seeks election or not, whether it engages either as a member or as a participant or not. And that council, I think the evidence shows clearly, will be substantially worse if the United States walks away for it. Now, some have been tempted to say we should start an alternative. And I think the problem with that is if we try to start an alternative, the Canadians, a few Pacific Islands, probably Israel will show up, and that's it. The Europeans, who are obviously critical to getting a working majority in any international body, will simply not participate in anything that looks like a substitute for the United Nations. But even more important, real hope of making the Human Rights Council a more effective body is to slowly change the policies of the new emerging democracies, of Brazil, of India, of Indonesia, of Mexico, of Argentina and Chile, and to get these, South Africa, to get Nigeria, to get these countries to begin to behave as they should, as countries who themselves benefit enormously from this UN system in their own struggles to establish democracy and end human rights abuses, and who are slowly, much too slowly, but nevertheless, in my view, slowly coming around to accepting the notion that the UN has both a right and an obligation to take action when a government is oppressing its own people. Now, the second point I would make is that if you ask the question of people struggling for democracy, of human rights activists, of human rights defenders in countries that are not democratic, they will all tell you that the Human Rights Council matters enormously to them. They will tell you that resolutions affect what happens, that the visits of rapporteurs, of special representatives of the UN to their countries, either country-specific mandates or functional mandates, that those visits make a difference and that they have some impact on their struggle for freedom. And they want the Human Rights Council to act, and they want the United States to be there. One of the areas that we've seen, I think, interesting progress is in the area of election to the Council. The Council has a unique system of electing its members. It requires a closed vote in the General Assembly, and it requires a state to get a majority of the members of the Assembly to vote affirmatively for them in order to be elected to the Council. And every 2 years, since the Council was created, there has been a candidate for the Council that was deemed unacceptable by the human rights community and eventually by many of the governments in the UN. And in every one of those cases, that country either withdrew, as Iran did, or was defeated for the Council, as other countries were. And the first time this was done was when Belarus was seeking election to the Council. And a group of NGOs met to discuss whether to try to defeat the candidacy of Belarus. And we decided that we had to start with human rights activists in Belarus. And so we went to them. Many of them were in prison, and asked them the question whether they knew Belarus was running for the Human Rights Council, whether they cared if Belarus was running, whether they thought they would be better off if Belarus was on the Council because somehow it would be co-opted by the culture, or what their view was. And to our surprise, we discovered, they all knew exactly that Belarus was running. They all cared deeply about it. They all told us that it would be an affront to their struggle for Belarus to be elected. And we got a group of letters from them, including some smuggled out of prison, calling upon other countries not to vote for Belarus. And Belarus was, in fact, defeated in a contested election for a seat on the Human Rights Council. Sri Lanka was later defeated, and Iran was forced to withdraw. So the elections have proven to be an opportunity for the international community to call attention of the community to bad human rights records of countries seeking to be on the Council. There is another provision, which I think most of us thought when it was put in was the right thing to do but would never be used, and it's a provision that says that the General Assembly, by 2/3 vote, can suspend a country from its membership on the Human Rights Council if they engage in gross and systematic violations of human rights. Well, on the recommendation of the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly voted to suspend Libya's membership on the Human Rights Council in an act which made it clear that both the Council and the General Assembly were prepared to act, at least in the most extreme and extraordinary situation. But the Council has also made progress largely because the United States has led skillfully, has created alliances with countries around the globe and not just from Western Europe in dealing with country-specific situations. There was an effort when the Council was created by the bad guys, led by Egypt and Pakistan and Libya, and with the support of China and Russia, to say the Council should never take up individual country-specific situations. That effort has been defeated. The Council has now had a number of special sessions on other countries. It has created special commissions of inquiry on Libya, Cote d'Ivoire, and Syria. And it has had, as I've said, special sessions dealing with emergency situations. It has also reinstated the rapporteur for Belarus and in a strong resolution on Belarus coming after a period in which it refused to deal with that situation. We've also seen progress on functional issues. There has been adopted for a number of years at the Council, with the U.S. absent, a resolution on defamation of religion, which suggested that free speech should be limited if countries or groups felt insulted because it insulted their religion. The United States worked very hard at the last session, the session before the last, and got a consensus resolution that talked about the right to freedom of religion, but completely moved away from the notion that there could be such a thing as defamation of religions. And in the last two sessions, two new special rapporteurs have been created on political issues, one dealing with the right of freedom of association and one dealing with the right for accountability for people who commit serious human rights abuses. Israel continues to be a problem, and I think everyone who looks at the Council believes that it gives far more attention to the Israeli-Palestinian problem than it deserves, and that its resolutions are almost always one-sided and against Israel. And I think the United States needs to continue, as it has, to work against it, to try to reach more balanced resolutions on the Middle East, and to try to get the Council to focus on serious and urgent human rights situations. But we will not succeed like that in walking away. And I do not believe that the Israeli government wants the United States to walk away. We will succeed by that, by engaging, by showing the other members of the Council that we are committed to an even-handed approach to human rights situations, and by working hard, as we've begun to do, to bring the new democracies into a position where they are strong supporters of an effective human rights council.
Thank you very much, Morton. Next, we'll turn to Brett Schaefer, the Che Kingham Fellow in International Regulatory Affairs at Heritage's Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. Schaefer analyzes a range of foreign policy issues, including focusing primarily on the United Nations and affiliated funds and programs. He's the editor of a 2009 book, Conundrum, The Limits of the United Nations and the Search for Alternatives. He worked in government in the Department of Defense, and he speaks and has written extensively on economic development and peace and security issues in sub-Saharan Africa. So we'll turn the floor over to him.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much to the Woodrow Wilson Center for hosting this panel today and for inviting me to participate on that panel. The Obama administration declared in 2009 that the U.S. would engage with and seek a seat on the Human Rights Council to, and quote, make it a more effective body to promote and protect human rights, and to, quote, strengthen and reform the Human Rights Council and enable it to live up to the vision that was crafted when it was created. There's no doubt in my mind that the administration has put in long hours and invested considerable effort and resources toward those goals since joining the Council in 2009. And the administration has identified about a dozen accomplishments arising in its determination from U.S. engagement and membership on the Council, including renewing or establishing special rapporteurs or independent experts on the human rights situations in Burma, North Korea, Sudan, and Iran, passing resolutions condemning human rights situations in Guinea, Kyrgyzstan, and Tunisia, and holding special sessions to investigate human rights situations in Cote d'Ivoire, Libya, and Syria, helping to secure resolutions, as mentioned by Mort, including creating a special rapporteur to protect freedom of assembly and association, and having the OIC offer an alternative text to its objectionable resolution on defamation of religions. I think that some of these accomplishments would have occurred without U.S. engagement in the Council, and others really didn't hinge on U.S. membership on the Council and could have been accomplished through U.S. intervention as an observer. For instance, the mandates on the special rapporteurs for Burma, North Korea, and Sudan had all been previously extended by the Human Rights Council before the U.S. was a member on that body. The resolutions condemning Kyrgyzstan, Guinea, and Tunisia focused on the actions of former governments, and the resolutions condemning the actions of those former governments were supported by the new governments that were present in the body at the time that they were offered, which is hardly tough sledding when you can get unanimous votes or actually no vote at all to pass those resolutions. Similarly, support for defamation of religions resolutions has actually declined quite substantially for a number of different years, both in the General Assembly and in the UN Human Rights Council. And the greatest ratio of that decline actually occurred under the Bush administration prior to U.S. membership on the Human Rights Council in 2009. I brought a background to our paper on this issue, and you can take a look at those trends, the voting trends from 2006 through this past year. Those voting trends indicate that eventually the OIC would have faced defeat or been forced to offer new text to avoid defeat, and regardless of whether the U.S. is a member on the Council or not. I think that the Obama administration deserves credit for continuing America's opposition to defamation of religions resolutions, but in my mind, U.S. membership on the Council was not the critical part or the critical piece in that achievement. Regardless, excuse me. Regardless, U.S. efforts undoubtedly were useful in facilitating some of those achievements listed by the administration, and the administration is justified in highlighting them. Sometimes, however, when you work closely on particular issues and you start to focus on getting individual goals accomplished rather than taking a step back and determining whether those individual goals are building upon each other to accomplish or achieve a broader objective. In this case, making the Council a strong defender of human rights. Given the Council's poor record, the Obama administration can reasonably argue that the Council has been slightly more effective than in the 2 years since it joined than it was in the 3 years previous to it joining the Council or to the U.S. membership thereon. But are those accomplishments really, as admirable as those accomplishments may be, are they really contributing to making the Council an effective body, an effective defender and promoter of human rights? In my opinion, the modest achievements cited by the administration do not lead to the conclusion that the Council is an effective body, nor is it likely to become an effective body in the foreseeable future. And the reason I state that is because you have to realize what the Council is supposed to be. It's supposed to be the premier human rights body in the entire world. The Council was created in 2006 to replace the discredited Commission on Human Rights. Kofi Annan, then Secretary General of the UN, described the Commission on Human Rights as a disappointment, and a disappointment so severe that it cast a shadow on the entire UN system as a whole. It's quite a condemnation. And the primary sins of the Commission were bias and hostility against Israel, the ease with which repressive countries were able to gain membership and gain seats on the Commission, to protect themselves from criticism, and a general unwillingness to confront human rights abuses fairly and objectively around the world. The Council was supposed to be better than the Commission, and the mandate for the Council clearly stated that the UN resolution establishing that body, its purposes were to promote universal respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms in a fair and equal manner, to promptly address violations of human rights, including gross and systematic violations, to operate under the principles of universality, impartiality, objectivity, and non-selectivity. In short, to live up to the vision crafted when it was created, it's not enough for the Council to do the right thing every once in a while. Even the Commission did something positive every once in a while, yet that didn't stop Kofi Annan from calling it or characterizing it as casting a shadow on the UN system as a whole. For the Council to be better than the Commission to fulfill the vision that was crafted when it was created, it needs to do the right thing reliably. It must be impartial and fair. It cannot target some countries yet ignore others. It cannot be subject to politicized deals wherein member states work together to shield each other from scrutiny. In looking over the record of the Council for the past 5 years, the evidence is clear that the Council has fallen far, far short of that standard. And I'll give you some examples about what I mean. First, the Council remains biased against and hostile toward Israel. Israel remains the only country subject to a permanent agenda item on the Council. All other country-specific mandates have to be renewed periodically. The Council has adopted 89 resolutions on specific countries, of which 39 focus on Israel, which is 44% of the total country resolutions adopted by the Council. 6 of the 14 special sessions of the Council called to look into urgent human rights situations in specific countries have been focused on Israel. Now, I'm not arguing that any country is perfect or above criticism, but when roughly half the actions of the Council focus on Israel, it kind of implies that Israel might be responsible for about half of the human rights violations around the world. And that's just plainly absurd. Yet the anti-Israel bias continues in the Council, even with the U.S. as a member. In fact, 15 of the 40 country-specific resolutions passed by the Council in 2010 and 2011, when the U.S. was on the body, focused on Israel. At the 16th session, just this past March, the Council adopted 6 anti-Israel resolutions over U.S. objections. Second, despite its explicit mandate to respond promptly to human rights situations around the world, the Council has been passive and unresponsive in the face of numerous ongoing human rights situations. The Council has passed resolutions on human rights situations in only 18 countries since it was established in 2006. Only a handful of countries with the world's worst human rights records, according to Freedom House. Sorry, I'm stealing your thunder a little bit.
Don't worry, I'll answer right back.
Have been criticized in the Council resolutions. There are Belarus, Burma, Cote d'Ivoire, Libya, North Korea, Somalia, Sudan, and Syria. The Council has ignored 12 of the worst human rights situations in the world, including those in China, Cuba, Eritrea, and Saudi Arabia. In addition, despite U.S. membership, the Council continues to ignore human rights violations in places like Bahrain, Pakistan, Equatorial Guinea, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and many other countries. Aside from Israel, the Council has convened a special session on human rights violations in only 7 countries, 8 different sessions, generally in response to intense media coverage of ongoing violence against civilians. In my mind, it should take something other than hundreds of dead protesters in the streets to motivate the Council to take notice and to take action. Finally, the Universal Periodic Review, which is widely considered to be the most effective part of the Council, is a plainly politicized process wherein repressive countries do their best to defend each other from scrutiny. Past UPR sessions have featured countries like China, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, most recently Syria just this past month, or earlier this month, offering false reports to the Council, laughably affirming their commitment to fundamental human rights and basic freedoms. These patently dishonest reports are accepted and approved by the Council. The UPR deliberations led to 167 recommendations for how North Korea could improve its human rights record. China and Cuba received 148 recommendations through its UPR process, respectively. By contrast, America's UPR report recommended that the U.S. adopt 280 changes to improve its human rights practices. Iran was a distant second at 212 recommendations. Thus, using the number of UPR recommendations as the standard, the Human Rights Council apparently determined that the U.S. needs to improve its observance of human rights more than any other country in the world. Again, this is just patently ridiculous. The problem is that the UPR process focuses predominantly on creating a list of human rights issues for the country to address that often focus on passing certain laws, cooperating with various human rights experts, or ratifying human rights treaties. This formulaic exercise creates a moral equivalent or moral equivalence process that's easily applied to every single country in the world. In essence, everybody's flawed, and therefore everybody is equally culpable in this lack of observance of human rights. And these recommendations, in fact, if you take a look at them, can often be implemented without changing the actual human rights situation on the ground in countries. They can adopt laws. They can ratify treaties. In fact, there are a number of countries that have exemplary laws on the books that have ratified treaties, yet do not observe those laws, do not observe the tenets of the treaty and the requirements of the treaty at all. And, I mean, fundamentally what it comes down to is that the UPR process depends on the willingness of a country to improve. But willing nations don't need the UPR. You know, the UPR may be useful for countries seeking a list of things that it could work on, but that list could easily be compiled by countries that are willing to solicit recommendations either from other countries, human rights experts, the NGOs, or various UN treaty bodies themselves. Meanwhile, unwilling nations are largely unaffected by the UPR, aside from a mildly embarrassing, generally non-confrontational discussion of short duration, and the likelihood that they're going to have a report that they will largely disregard and ignore. A critical reason behind the Council's failure to fulfill its mandate is the absence of any meaningful membership criteria other than geographic representation. As a result, countries with good human rights records have historically been outnumbered on the Council. The 2000 election completed last May resulted in the worst balance of countries in the history of the Council. And I was just talking with Paula. Her numbers are slightly different from mine. I think I have one less partly free and one more not free country listed. I'm not sure why that is.
This takes into account that Libya's been suspended, so it's
okay.
46.
Okay. But according to Freedom House, minus the Libya suspension, the number of free countries with good human rights human rights records remained at an all-time low of 20 in 2011. The 15 partly free countries with questionable human rights records sit on the Council, and meanwhile, the number of not free countries, including Libya, rose to an all-time high of 12. And when you take a look at that breakdown, when you realize that you have a majority of the Human Rights Council that is comprised of countries with either questionable or flawed human rights practices and records, or downright terrible records, is it any surprise that the Human Rights Council has fallen short of expectations? In short, after 5 years, two with the U.S. as an active, eager participant, the record of the Council is virtually the same as the Commission it replaced. It remains biased against Israel. It deliberately disregards many of the serious human rights situations around the world. Its examination of human rights is weak and politicized, and governments with terrible human rights records remain able to seek seats and win seats on the Council with the intent to subvert its agenda. The problems besetting the Council are systemic and fundamental. They are too much for any country, even the United States, to overcome simply by being on the Council as a member and working to overcome them. The best chance for fixing those fundamental problems on the Council was to adopt stronger rules, procedures, and standards during the review of the Council that was mandated during in the 2006 resolution establishing that body. That review was completed earlier this year. Unfortunately, every single proposal for addressing the Council's anti-Israel bias, strengthening the membership criteria, or creating a more competitive and rigorous process for electing members to the Council were rejected out of hand, in the words of the administration. As long as these problems remain, the U.S. efforts to positively influence the Council will be difficult, and they will rarely be permanent. A few minor changes were made to the UPR, but they will not make the UPR into the type of honest, confrontational assessment of human rights practices that repressive countries would actually fear to engage in. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can take the word of the administration. When the resolution for the mandate was passed this past June, the administration stated, and I'll quote, "The final resolution before us fails to address the core problems that still plague the Human Rights Council. We deeply regret that this opportunity has been missed. The United States has therefore voted no on this resolution." The U.S. was only one of 4 countries to vote against it. Everybody else thought it was just hunky-dory. Sadly, it looks like the future of the Council is going to be very similar to the past 5 years. A general sense or record of disappointment with occasional moments of outrage or satisfaction. In my opinion, the Council simply isn't worth the effort. Rare successes can be achieved, but generally the effort necessary to achieve those successes outweighs the benefits that accrue from that achievement. I mean, when you take a look at it, you have to step back. The Council is a powerless body for the most part. It can't sanction or punish countries. It can't even suspend countries from its own body. It has to go to the General Assembly to get that done. The power of the Council rests primarily on its ability to name and shame countries and to dispatch human rights experts to examine human rights situations. The strength of that power lies in the prestige and the moral clarity of the Council. And while I'll be the first one to sit up and appreciate any justified condemnation that comes out of the Council, when the Council is so obviously politicized, selective, and biased, its credibility is inevitably going to be damaged and be affected by that perception. And its condemnation is going to be open to criticism from that because of that those flaws. Now, I believe the administration, when it entered into this process, honestly thought that many UN member states sincerely wanted to make the Human Rights Council work. And they thought that the U.S. membership on the Council and U.S. leadership could really tip the balance in favor of those countries and rally countries to support making the Council a more effective and strong body to advance human rights. And that's why the administration said that it wanted to go into the Council to make it a more effective body. Now, I will point out that it said that it wanted to make the Council more effective, not to make it effective. And if you set the bar low enough, anything can be made more effective, and the Council certainly set the bar low enough. But that's really the point, isn't it? We shouldn't be measuring the Council by the low expectations that it set for itself. We should be measuring the Council by the measure that we would expect of the world's most premier human rights body. And what would the world's most premier human rights body, what would we expect that to do? And from that perspective, it's impossible to avoid the conclusion that the Council has proven embarrassingly deficient. And it remains that way even after the U.S. has been on the Council for 2 years. Now, I supported the U.S. effort to try and get fundamental changes enacted in the Council through the mandatory review. I made recommendations for what those changes should be. I met with the administration repeatedly. I talked with UN officials about that. And I hoped, and I had pointed to that point, that opportunity as something that should be seized. But unfortunately, that ship has sailed, and the U.S. now faces diminishing returns on its investment in the Council. Quite simply, the effort needed to block countries from getting elected to the Council or making minor improvements on various resolutions far exceeds the gains realized. Mort mentioned every year we have a country that comes up that is targeted for opposition in its election in the General Assembly. Sometimes that country is successfully opposed. Sometimes they withdraw. But as I mentioned, you have 12 other countries on the Council that did get elected, sometimes by overwhelming majorities. Libya was elected by 155 votes in the General Assembly. I would argue that Gaddafi's human rights record wasn't dramatically worse before what happened this spring when he was actually elected to the Council by 155 countries approving. You only have to take a look at 40 years of repression and killing by his regime to testify to that. Yet he was perfectly acceptable except when the media scrutiny arrived last spring. That led to Libya's suspension. In my opinion, the U.S. should reduce its engagement with the Council and intervene only to defend vital U.S. interests. Sometimes those interests would involve the U.S., sometimes involve Israel, sometimes involve principles. Those who say that if the U.S. abandons the field, repressive regimes will go ahead and undermine the agenda of the Council and take it away from where it should be, I would argue that those people need to wake up and realize that that's already happening. In fact, it has been happening for 5 years. And U.S. membership hasn't shifted the balance dramatically away from that. If those countries do go overboard and embarrass the Council and dramatically move it away from its agenda of defending human rights. I would hope that that would just bring more scrutiny to the body and hopefully lead for calls for it to be replaced or substantially reformed, as happened to the Commission before it that led to the Council being created in the first place. In the meantime, the Council is not the only game in town. The U.S. can express its opinions and condemn human rights violations in official statements, either bilaterally in the Council or in the Third Committee of the UN, either alone or in conjunction with other countries. It can voluntarily and does support the more independent and effective aspects of the UN human rights system, like the High Commissioner's Office or the independent experts. And it can do that without being a member of the Council. In conclusion, the Council has proven gravely disappointing and will continue to be gravely disappointing regardless of the United States membership on that body, because the fundamental flaws of that body that make it susceptible to that, the agenda of the repressed countries, and the inability to confront countries reliably, objectively, and fairly, and quickly remain in place. Institutionalized mediocrity and ineffectiveness in the defense of fundamental human rights and basic freedoms shouldn't be acceptable in the United Nations system. It shouldn't be acceptable to the United States. The U.S. membership on the Council is, in effect, an endorsement of that low standard, and we shouldn't accept that. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. We'll next hear from Paula Schriefer, who's the Advocacy Director at Freedom House, where she's worked for a number of years. In that current capacity, she oversees Freedom House's advocacy, outreach, and communications activities, including foreign policy advocacy and coordination with international organizations. Previously, she served in the organization as Director of Programs, overseeing Freedom House's nearly 24 major program initiatives and 13 overseas offices. Previously, she worked at the National Endowment for Democracy. Paula?
Thanks so much, and thanks also to the Wilson Center and OSF for sponsoring this important event. It really, I'm quite behind in producing our annual report card on the Human Rights Council. This forced me to get my act together and put out a policy paper on the topic, and the Council report card will be coming out shortly. I have to say that I certainly agree with a number of the points that my friend Brett makes on the Council. Many of those points are found in our annual report cards, but I disagree on many of the conclusions that he makes, and most importantly, I disagree on the conclusion over engagement or not. As can already be seen from the discussion we've had so far, most of the primary arguments about whether or not the U.S. should engage on the Council, and I use that word rather than just say sit on the Council, have a seat, because engagement to me means a great deal more than that. Most of the arguments revolve around whether or not the Council is a fundamentally flawed structure, and therefore whether the U.S. engagement with the Council legitimizes that flawed structure. Our own system of rating countries into free, partly free, and not free, as we've also seen, are often used to make the case on why the Council is flawed, because it contains a number of not free countries that sit on that body. And the second primary argument revolves around this issue of the disproportionate focus on Israel. Those are all valid reasons, and I'll talk about those a little bit more at length. But I think, in fact, the most important question to ask regarding the Council is whether or not ultimately the body holds intrinsic value for the advancement of human rights despite its flaws, and whether U.S. engagement on the Council thus increases that value or not. In my view, and this is where I disagree with my friend very respectfully, I think the answer to both of those questions is actually yes. I'll start talking a little bit about the elections. I won't go into huge detail here because it's already been discussed by some of my colleagues. I've got just a few little kind of charts and graphs that help people get a sense of some of the things that have already been talked about, which is sort of this breakdown in membership on the Council. In fact, for most of the years that the Council has been in existence, the membership has actually been better than it was on the Commission on Human Rights. You can see there 2005 was the last year on the Commission. The exceptions have actually been the current year and then the year before that. And in fact, the year previous to this year was the worst in terms of Council membership in the free, partly free, and not free breakdowns. However, I think it's really important, and here's a couple of different types of ways of looking at that information. This is a comparison of the Council versus the world writ large, and I think that you can see that by and large for every year, again, except for last year, the Council has actually been better than the overall breakdown of world rankings according to Freedom House, except in that year of 2010. And then the current year, it's almost a direct mirror of what you find in terms of the world breakdown. I should point out that composition certainly matters. And I think that when you look at some of the really aggressive members of the council, here's the list of the not free countries that currently sit on the council. Some of those, particularly Russia, China, Cuba, are very active. They certainly make great effort to get elected to sit on the council as well as to drive the agenda when they sit on the council. However, I think it's important to keep in mind that the reverse is not always exactly true. So countries that have a pretty positive human rights record, and I'll go look up to the free countries that sit on the council, don't necessarily always vote the right way when it comes to human rights issues either. And frankly, that has often been more of the problem on the council than sort of the miscreants, who are really actually quite small in number, but manage to be more influential than they should be, and certainly that was more true when the U.S. wasn't on the council. Interestingly as well, going back to this chart here, the year 2010, which was the worst in terms of performance, was actually the year that the council performed the best in terms of the resolutions that it passed, in focusing on issues of extreme human rights abuses in country-specific situations. That was the year in which the new mandate on freedom of assembly was passed. So interestingly, there's not this direct linkage necessarily just between the composition and what the council actually manages to do. I'll talk briefly about the issue of Israel and what I call the ongoing problem of impunity for some of the leading authoritarians. Certainly it's true, as has been mentioned, that there is a disproportionate focus on Israel. No one could deny that. As Brett pointed out, it is the only country in the world that has a permanent agenda item at each of the council sessions, which is ridiculous. Not only are there many resolutions passed on Israel, the language of those resolutions is extraordinarily harsh. The only language that could even compare would be the resolutions that pass relatively easily on North Korea, a country that represents almost the complete absence of freedom and human rights in Freedom House's rankings, and it obviously doesn't make sense that Israel would be put in that category. So the language is biased, it's always one-sided, and there are many of them. However, I think it's also important to remember that this is an issue that is global in nature, and it is not exclusive to the Human Rights Council. Israel does not have friends at the UN, period. And many of the countries that vote in favor of these resolutions are fully free countries. Many of those countries are free countries found in Latin America and in Western Europe. So it is a bigger problem than is unique to the Council. However, I want to emphasize I agree with what Mort has said. It has become vastly better since the U.S. has come on the Council. Unfortunately, they did not succeed in removing the permanent agenda item as should have taken place in the review process. However, keep in mind that of the first 6 special sessions, 4 were on Israel. Of the past 17 total special sessions, 6 has been on Israel. Okay, this is the area where the council performs the worst, and again, you'd like to see it performing better than the lowest common denominator. Nonetheless, that's actually a pretty substantial improvement. The other issue where the council really where it struggles is holding powerful and influential countries to account. China, of course, has never had a resolution passed against it, either at the Commission or at the Council. It's very hard to foresee that happening in the future. Countries like Cuba and Russia, Venezuela escape that kind of scrutiny as well. It's not inconceivable. I would have said it was very hard. And in fact, a year ago, I would never have thought we would have gotten an Iran resolution through. However, countries that have strong economic influence as China or strong symbolic influence as countries that try to represent themselves as anti-West, anti-U.S., they still maintain a lot of sympathy among many of the countries on the Council, including, again, countries that are in the free and the partly free category. So it's not an exclusively not free, repressive country problem when you talk about some of those issues. And again, as Mort points out, what is really the alternative? If you look at the breakdown, again, of countries, and you look at these list of countries, I handed out a sheet, I don't know if you all managed to grab it at the entrance, which also lists the different regional blocs that the members of the Council are affiliated with. And you'll find that every one of the free and partly free countries are also members of the community of democracies. A number of the not free countries are also members of the community of democracies. So I really don't know what this alternative body would look like, but I can tell you right now that the democracies can't be trusted to set it up and pick the membership in a way that we're going to be happy with either. Why the Council is relevant in my mind, despite these flaws that I've already talked about. First and foremost is that it remains and has been a body that sets up international norms on human rights. It is the only global human rights body. And precisely because countries that are antagonistic towards the U.S., towards the West, towards what they call the developed world, precisely because those bodies can get elected to sit on the Council, it therefore has a legitimacy globally and internationally that either a U.S. or democracy-led body or a regional organization could never have. In my view, if one truly believes that human rights are universal, they are not merely the creation of the West, they are not a luxury of the wealthy, only a global body that is reflective of the world's political landscape really has the credibility to create these kinds of standards around which the populations of these countries can rally and demand more and demand fundamental human rights. And I will say, if you look at the Arab Spring, and Freedom House spends a lot of its time working directly with human rights defenders in these countries that we rate poorly on our scorecards, if you talk to those people and you ask them what they want, the language that they speak and the demands that they make in terms of the rights that they want are grounded in these universal norms. And yes, it's true, countries pass laws and they get on the Council to legitimize themselves, et cetera, and they think that they can then get away with not doing the right thing when it comes to practice. That is true to an extent. However, it creates a massive advocacy opportunity for its own populations and a legitimacy problem for these governments that they can't overcome when people really decide that they've had enough. They are going to demand these rights. They know that they're universal. They know that they are cemented in international treaties, and it gives them a basis upon which to go and ask for these fundamental rights that they are delivered to them. That wouldn't exist, frankly, without the UN system, without the treaties and the Council, which, of course, is a political body. I want to point out, speaking of, one of these issues, and some of these activists talk to Iranians. It took 2 years for the Council to react appropriately on Iran. That was unacceptable. It was frustrating. However, it happened, and to say that the U.S. hasn't made a difference, it just couldn't be more wrong. A year ago, even on the 1-year anniversary of the crackdown in Iran, the U.S. had only been on the Council for a short period of time. It barely could, and together with other rights-respecting countries, could barely muster up a statement of 45 nations, most of whom were not even members of the Council, on Iran. A year later, with a lot of investment and cross-regional work, not only did you have a really strong resolution on Iran, you had the creation of the first new independent mandate mechanism focused on reporting on Iran. And to say that Iran doesn't care is absolutely wrong. It puts up enormous amounts of effort to prevent that type of thing of happening. It's true. This body, this rapporteur, can't send in an army to force the government to reform. But let me tell you, for those Iranians every day who are battling to get increased rights, that mandate for them gave them a whole new, renewed spirit of energy and motivation and an opportunity to push for those rights. It, in and of itself, will not make that change happen, but it's really, really significant. Other areas where engagement has absolutely paid off, some of them have already been talked about, renewing the country mandates, Somalia, Sudan, Burma, North Korea. Every year, Freedom House puts out a list of the world's most repressive societies. And we put it out initially, and we would distribute it at the Human Rights Council saying, why aren't there resolutions and actions being taken on these countries? Typically, there are 9 countries get the absolute lowest ratings in our score. Another 8 or 9 get the second to the lowest, and we call them the worst of the worst, the world's most repressive societies. I have to say, in the past couple of years, we have seen more actions on the worst of the worst countries than we saw in decades going back looking at the Human Rights Commission. Could it do more? Absolutely. But the fact that it's the UN, the fact that it's a global body making these actions, not the United States saying it on its own, not the European Union that can be accused of bias, really does make a difference in terms of the ability of the human rights defenders in those countries to call into question the legitimacy of their government. So I'll wrap up and say, in our view, we recognize the many flaws and problems associated with the Council, but our view is that means more engagement is needed, not less. And the idea that the United States, the wealthiest country in the world, can't walk and chew gum at the same time, cannot work at the General Assembly, cannot work at the Third Committee, cannot work in regional organizations, and sit on the Human Rights Council and try to make changes there, I don't buy it. If China and Russia and Cuba can do it, you're damn sure can bet the United States can do it. So I just don't buy that. I'm sorry. I would also just say that, Freedom House is celebrating its 70th anniversary this year. There are, in this world right now, many more free people than there were in 1941 when Freedom House was established. However, there are still 2.5 billion people in this world who live in countries that we designate as not free. We were founded under the belief that people who live in freedom have a moral obligation to help expand the freedoms of those that don't. And I don't think that we can do that simply through our bilateral efforts. I think we need to do it through the really tough slogging that takes place at these multilateral institutions. It is hard work. It is hotly contested. We don't always win, but I think that the payoff is much more valuable than the costs of not doing so. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Our final panelist is Ruth Wedgwood, the Edward Burling Professor of International Law and Director of the International Law Program at Johns Hopkins SAIS over the last decade. Primary focus of her public service has been as a member of the United Nations Human Rights Committee in Geneva, monitoring the compliance of 167 member countries under the standards of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. She was elected by the states to 2 terms, served as a rapporteur. Her career has combined the fields of international law, human rights, and international security and criminal law. She taught at Yale before joining the faculty at Johns Hopkins University. The floor is yours.
Well, I suppose I could take a very politique position of agreeing with everybody, which I do. So I'll have to lead the chiaroscura and the badinage, the reconciliation of small hobgoblin mind that can't entertain contradictions to you all. So I guess I ended about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, but I did spend a good deal of my time in Geneva. There's a wonderful novel called Belle de Seigneur, which is a description of the League of Nations leading up to World War II. And I once had the great honor of giving the Sean Lester Lecture in Ireland, which was named for the Secretary General of the UN, who served in Geneva to wrap up shop during the Second World War, when it was clear that the archives hadn't done their work. So I do take on and appreciate and endorse many of the slightly desolate conclusions that have been reached. I'm also, though, an old girl hockey player, left-inner, too short to do lacrosse except by running through their legs. And I guess I do think that once in a while, if you sit at the table and stay awake eating gumdrops, that there are opportunities that present themselves which you can use to good effect. And my other general conclusion is that it's the same world out there, almost whatever modality you operate in. The same politics, the same countries affect the performance of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the GA, and to some large degree the Third Committee. And you just have to get good at playing UN politics, busting up the cartels of the regional organizations, looking for opportunity where you can create it and using it, learning how to use publicity. The UN is a very self-referential organization that doesn't know nothing about the press, how you get legs on your story, and generates documents that often are not read. And if you're good at that, I was taught everything I know about the press by Rudy Giuliani, who took out all the telephones from the library and put in took out all the chairs from the library and put in telephones so he could file his reporters could file their stories after an announcement of an indictment was given on a particular afternoon. But there is an art to making life easy for the press, and in fact, getting the enormous amplification that good press coverage can give you. So I guess my opening line will be, so to say, I'm like Rick in Casablanca. I'm shocked to discover there's politics going on at the United Nations, and Roman Haruska. Why shouldn't mediocre people have representation on the Supreme Court too? Well, why shouldn't nasty countries also be seeking to take part in the world's largest, most inclusive organization? Most of the countries' governments are quite nasty. So that is going to be a pervasive fact that you just have to engineer around. So I really am going to give a sincere mixed perspective. I like UPR in the sense that it's the only time that countries have to show up. I sat on treaty body, the treaty body I sat on had the largest representation, but we had a good 50, 60 countries that never came, and we didn't chase them down. We had a procedure where we could have given a report in absentia, challenging them not to show, and then finally one of them would show, but we did one or two of those a year maybe. Instead we kept doing the Dutch and the Swedes over and over again at 4-year intervals or 5-year intervals. UPR, like it or not, they have to come. Everybody sends an ambassador to Geneva for their UPR. Yes, it's glad-handing. Yes, there's a lot of congratulatory backslapping. Yes, there absolutely should be more NGO participation in the UPR process. But countries do show up, and many of them don't have any other occasion when they are even notionally put in the hot seat. There are some special rapporteurs who are very good. I read a triplex of rapporteur reports recently who had gone to Brazil. They all, you could argue they were duplicative, but they all had the same dire diagnosis of what it's like to live in the countryside of a state which is dominated by still a kind of padrone culture in the rural areas. Some are really very brave and very serious. They don't have budgets that they need to do their work. They have to beg for budgets from NGOs, but some of them are serious people. There are some loony ones as well. And in fact, sometimes people get elected almost as a slap in the face, sort of take that. So that I think the name of special rapporteur doesn't by itself necessarily carry the dignity one would wish. But there are some serious people out there. The High Commissioner, believe it or not, whoever she is also affected by politics. And you've had some High Commissioners and some acts by each High Commissioner that have been principled and brave and important. But the High Commissioner also feels very much currently especially, at the mercy of the Human Rights Council. The Council is quite, and this is a negative comment more than Paula, is asserting, at least in private, the purported authority to regulate the High Commissioner. Her personnel policy, trying to affect what she looks at. And I'll just tell you, the last 2 High Commissioners I've known have felt under pressure from the Council. And that's something where we should buck up the High Commissioner or force them to buck up. I'll give you one small example. The treaty body that I was on, which is largely law professors and human rights professionals and retired diplomats, it was drained of its resources to do its work in any proper way by the Human Rights Council. I won't name the country. It's a really important country. We got the concluding observations for editing on Thursday afternoon to be sent back after 3 hours with a 35-page report for Friday morning delivery. You can't work if you haven't got translation, if you haven't got staff members who are allowed to learn the jurisprudence of the treaty bodies, if you have to beg for travel monies. The Council has been a huge drain on the proliferating treaty bodies and their work, and at the very time that countries are, I think at times lightheartedly, albeit sincerely, creating more and more newer and newer treaty bodies, all of whose topics are important: handicapped, migrant workers, the elderly, of which Martin and I are becoming, adult persons we call them. Y'all are juniors. But it's a real problem that no one's paying attention to the fact that the proliferation of treaty bodies, the upward curve is exactly matched by the downward curve in the resources. So if I was running the State Department, I would fight very hard, and the Congress, to make sure that the High Commissioner understands that she can't do this. I would give dedicated funds that can only be used to support the treaty bodies. I'd be much more item-specific, line item special donations to force the hand to give a countervailing pressure that the High Commissioner can then rely on when she has to politely say no to what the Council demands of her. I will say my other amused revelation in Geneva was that old Cold War statecraft still carries the day more often than you would suppose. I met Alfonso Martinez, who did the Zionism as Racism way back when. He's still eating lunch there in the seaside cafes. He was running the subcommittee on the subcommission on gross and systematic human rights abuses for a while. Egypt, Cuba, and now Algeria are all taking generally unhelpful stances, even though there are many, many fine people of each country. But they still are the whip for the regional caucuses, the ideological caucuses. They're still very good at what they do, which is playing the role of spoiler. And a proposal can die a borning if one really bumptious third secretary from a mission that has given him these general marching orders becomes raucous and disruptive. So don't suppose that everybody was miraculously transformed or had their soul saved just because we renamed the commission the council. I would use the third committee a lot more. I love this little phrase of competitive multilateralism. I believe in it. I didn't invent it. I would use voluntary budgets, voluntary donations, earmarked donations, much more unembarrassedly. I would have people who make those earmarks far more cognizant of the inside baseball that is spoken of among denizens of Geneva. Now, to our favorite topic, Jew-centricity, as Adam Garfinkel once said in his book, or for those of us, again, to have listened to Tom Lehrer, the MIT mathematician, who wrote two wonderful records of funny political songs and then fell silent. There was no more to say. Everybody hates the Jews, he said in his wonderful song. The Bulgarians hate the Icelandics hate the Finns hate the Swedes, but everybody hates the Jews. That, I fear me, is true at the United Nations. And it's the one subject they can all agree on. And one, of course, should not be the least bit naive about the depth of anti-Semitism in Europe. So it's not just problems of North Africa or the Islamic world. And that has to be changed. How do you change it? I don't really know. Perhaps the guerrilla theater that's put on by Hillel Neuer for UN Watch, perhaps being a bit more pushy again on earmarks. Certainly it's scandalous that Israel is not allowed into the regional organization to which it would have to belong to actually circulate documents in Geneva. It can't get into WEOG, the Western European and Others group. The U.S. is only now trying the alternative of juice cans, Japan, U.S., Australia, and New Zealand. But it's for a council that purports to be inclusive, not to allow Israel to have a membership in which it can take part in pre-caucus deliberations is not acceptable. I do think that there has to be a lot of... I've been friends with Richard Goldstone since he came to America in 1989. And it's a complicated friendship, but it's a real friendship. But I think even he was blindsided by the council. And when he was put on a 5-month or 6-month, got a report by September timetable, he should have, and perhaps in retrospect he would have, said no. To do a careful study of a war, you have to, in fact, abide by the norm of complementarity, the very norm that the ICC, the criminal court, espouses. That you have to make sure that the local spade work that you need to have accurate fact-finding has time to work its process through. And you also really must take facts, as any trial lawyer knows, in circumstances where the witnesses feel free to speak to you without having threats made or having their careers ruined. So I think the unhappy results, to my mind, of the Goldstone Commission have a lot to do with the way that the council operates. And here I agree with Brett. The patina of uber legitimacy that the council has makes it very hard to say no to them. Mary Robinson, when she was asked to do the Goldstone Commission before Richard was, said no. I think because she knew what she was getting into. She'd been High Commissioner, been there, done that. Richard, I think, made a mistake in supposing he could accept their timetable. And also, I think in the UN, one of the real problems is who does the spade work, who does the staff work. And you may discover, just speculating, that many UN reports are signed by one person and written by some others. And therefore, having, as Rolf Achaeus knew in UNSCOM, having the integrity of your own staff, the independence of your own staff, devil's in the details, is absolutely necessary to doing the quality of work that will, I think, give human rights examinations the legitimacy they need to succeed in the long term. And finally, my last thought is just for NGOs. The one theme we kept hearing over and over in Geneva was that Northern NGOs, with all the wonderful work they do, including Freedom House with its 70th anniversary dinner coming up, to which you should all come and give money so we don't go broke, and can sustain the map at the museum. Nonetheless, Northern NGOs in general are organizations just like any other. They like to grow. And what you really do need are indigenous NGOs, which grow capacity locally, which don't know how to compete as well for foundation dollars, but will have the cultural legitimacy, the authenticity that I think helps their recommendations to be taken seriously. The one thing that my 8 years in Geneva persuaded me of is that most countries don't know very much about themselves. You ask them a question, how many people are in prison? How many are HIV positive? They don't know. They really don't know. There's a kind of chaos and opacity, and that involves capacity building, yes, by giving money to the state, but also by funding all the little busybodies, the Miss Marples of the world. That's who I wanted to be when I grew up, by the way. But local Miss Marples, who will go around with ballpoint pens and clipboards and gather facts and give them the access to the press that, at the moment, I think is too often monopolized by the NGOs of Europe and North America. So I wish I agreed with Brett fully, because then I just throw the baby in the bathwater out and start again. But same damn faucet. The bathwater is just the way it was before. So instead, I'm going to put a lot of iodine on the baby and hope for the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I might just exercise the prerogative of the chair with a comment on the 4 presentations to put it into a context of the mission of the Wilson Center. I think it's particularly appropriate to be having this type of conversation at the Woodrow Wilson Center, which is the nation's official memorial to our 28th president, who's identified with primarily with his role after World War I in trying to forge a post-war international order. I think today's topic, and I should say that under our current new president, former Congresswoman Jane Harman, the Center's has adopted a new programmatic agenda, which a primary focus of which is on the emerging contours of the new international order with the rise of new powers, shifts in the American role. Today's topic strikes me, and sort of being part of that planning process and listening to today's discussion is very much of a kind in that, for better or worse, we live in a state, in an international system where states remain the primary units, and today's discussion is sort of an echo of the debate that occurred when the United Nations was founded, and whether internal governance should be a criterion or not for membership in that body, and was debated in the founding, and was decided that they would not make internal governance a criterion for membership.
Couldn't have any members.
Yes, yeah, and the argument was that otherwise you'd have these rogue states, as they called them, that would be beyond the kin of the United Nations. So the question has been, how can international organizations in a world of sovereign states, where states can hide behind sovereignty, kind of get some tractions in terms of how states treat their own individuals? I don't know the perception of how, when states are voted into the council, how that's portrayed. Certainly in a world where you have 60 partly free and 47 not free countries, and this body has many who are in those latter categories, it it certainly doesn't convey that these states are compliant with human rights norms, or it shouldn't, whatever the characterization of it. The United States has sort of been ambivalent about it. I mean, I think we're one of the few countries, if not the only, that withholds diplomatic recognition. It's almost as though diplomatic recognition is a sign of kind of a moral judgment about whether to have relations with that state or not. Many countries, Britain, European countries, it's a pragmatic assessment of who's in power. And hence this temptation to sort of, and going back to the initial UN debate, of set up a community of democracies or sort of a parallel organization of like-minded states. That impulse has been there. So in terms of today's debate, there are kind of two arguments in play. One would be, and I recall it was reported in the early George W. Bush administration, when there was a debate about whether or not to engage North Korea on the pros and cons of an NSC a memorandum that was leaked out to the press. One of the pros for not engaging was that the United States would maintain moral clarity. So you have the moral clarity argument about abstaining from involvement in these organizations. But I think that the other set of arguments that have been evident here is sort of a utilitarian argument, and just sort of like being in allows us to be a voice and to have influence. And I'm interested sort of from the narrow, I mean, I understand the moral clarity argument, but just from a kind of a pure kind of utilitarian argument in terms of furthering American interests and values, where the speakers come down. Brad, I take it from that criterion, you would argue that even from a utilitarian perspective, the judgment is that it's not in the U.S. interest to be in the organization.
In the Human Rights Council?
Yeah.
No, actually I don't. Let me clarify something here. Within the UN system, you have multiple aspects of the UN human rights apparatus. The Council is one of those methods for addressing that situation. High Commissioner is another, the treaty bodies are another, the independent experts, the special rapporteurs are others, and the question is, what is the UN Human Rights Council providing that is unique, that could not be served by some other body? And when you take a look at the UN system, the Third Committee receives reports from the UN human rights experts. It receives reports from the High Commissioner. It receives reports from the UN Human Rights Council. A lot of effort is put into every year opposing the election of one country or two countries from being elected or seated on the Human Rights Council. And as we see from the actions of the Council, the dynamics in the Council aren't substantially different from what you have in the UN General Assembly. You have the same not repressive countries represented in the Council. You have the same countries with good human rights records on there that either act in consistency with human rights practices or do not. Or you have countries in the middle as well. If that's the dynamic, why are we fighting to keep a particular country off and expending all that diplomatic effort trying to get countries to vote one way or another in a particular election? Why not just seek to get rid of the Human Rights Council and move the deliberations of that matter to the Third Committee? It's a universal membership committee. And you wouldn't have this effort expended on membership elections every single year. And you would have the same problems you would have in the Human Rights Council, but at least you wouldn't have duplicate bodies and the waste of effort and time and diplomatic chits being expended on something that ultimately is not going to fundamentally affect the ability of the body or the Human Rights Council to make it a better body, a stronger defender of human rights. I mean, if that's what I've assumed from everybody's here is this is what the United Nations is. This is a political body, and therefore, and you need to have all these countries in there. Well, if that's the case, then why have elections at all? Why not just go to the Third Committee? It seems very duplicative and wasteful of time, effort, and resources. And a number of years ago, you could have made the case that, well, the General Assembly isn't in session year-round. And for the most part, that's true for the Third Committee. It meets mostly during the fall. But all the other parts of the UN, every delegation is there year-round these days. There's no reason why the Third Committee couldn't take up issues on a yearly basis or a year-round basis, or in extenuating circumstances meet to address human rights situations around the world. I mean, essentially, the member states decide for themselves what the agenda items are and what the procedures are and what the calendar is. So, to me, it just doesn't make any sense. The only reason to have a Human Rights Council, if it's going to be a body comprised of states that are superior, that actually adhere to these human rights standards, so that it can have a moral clarity to issue statements from a position of legitimacy. We don't have that.
Okay, Morton?
Yeah, but I think that is the goal, and I think we need to keep working towards that goal. There actually was a proposal to replace the Human Rights Commission with a Human Rights Council, including all the members of the General Assembly, and it was rejected in part because of the feeling that we did want to try over time to establish criteria for membership, and as slow and difficult that process is, I think it is worth continuing. It also, I think, is the case that the council now meets much more quickly and much more often than the third committee would, and has had special sessions, many that we don't like on Israel, but a number now on serious human rights violations. I also think it's important to understand that the special rapporteurs, which almost everybody likes, are creatures of the council. They are created by council resolutions. They are appointed by the president of the council on the recommendation of an advisory body consisting of one representative from each country. They're of almost uniformly high quality and have played an important role in many countries. And they would not be of such high quality if the council wasn't as good as it is. It obviously could be much better, but I think we need to remember it could be much worse. You could have presidents of the council who are from non-democratic countries, which we have not had since the council was created. And you could have a process of selecting rapporteurs that selected people who did not understand what human rights were all about. That has not happened. That is one of the most important achievements of the council, and it depends on the active participation of the United States, of other democratic countries, of persuading the democratic countries on the council that they really ought to pay attention to that and care about it.
Paula, or
Yeah, just a couple of
Ruth,
points.
yeah.
One, I hear the argument that Brett is making, and I think Mort kind of hit the nail on the head. We do want something that can ultimately be better. And the whole idea was actually, and what the U.S. had been pushing for, was a much smaller council than in what, in fact, we got. The commission, I believe, was 56 members. We had wanted a much smaller, more focused body of countries that would, by and large, be rights-respecting countries, right? That's what the U.S. was pushing for. When that didn't ultimately happen with the reorganization of the council is when the U.S. kind of got mad and said, well, we're not going to play because we don't like this play box anymore. You guys didn't reconstruct it the way we wanted. It would have been better to have a smaller body. It would have been better to have had criteria as opposed to just guidelines for the UN members, which there are guidelines where the UN members are supposed to take the human rights record of the country into account when they're voting. As Brett pointed out, a country like Saudi Arabia nonetheless manages to get 155 votes, meaning that only 30-some countries either went and got a cup of coffee or had the nerve to actually vote no against a country like Saudi Arabia. However, that has only happened in the case when there hasn't been a competing country running against a country with a really poor record. So the reality is that the General Assembly is responsible essentially for the composition of the council. So the idea that the third committee is easier to work for, it's the same countries as the full GA who do things like vote for cruddy countries like Saudi Arabia to sit on the council and Libya, et cetera. Although they did, of course, then vote to pull Libya back off again a mere 9 months later. And as Brett points out, it's not like the record was massively changed since then, but there were sort of different circumstances taking place. I think the main argument to keep the council is that one is that it will be there regardless. The U.S. can't just unilaterally decide we don't like the idea of the council, we're going to focus on the third committee, and therefore if we ignore it, it's not going to continue to be there and be the source of legitimacy and norms on human rights issues. So that's the reality. Let's be there. Let's play the system. Let's make it better. Second, the fact that it is a smaller body in many ways does make it more manageable in terms of the kind of politicking that you have to do behind the scenes to get countries to vote the right way on issues. If you have to look at the entire body of the General Assembly every time you're trying to push on a certain issue and identify what are the movable countries and what are the key countries, it becomes a much, much bigger issue to manage. One of the reasons why it works somewhat at the Third Committee now is because it doesn't deal with all of the issues that the Council is dealing with. If it did, that kind of political investment would be massive to deal with the votes on every one of the issues that came up there. So I think that, yes, the Council could have been set up better. Yes, it would have been great if there were actual criteria, a minimum that there aren't actually sanctions against the country. And clearly, the UN members are not going to agree to the Freedom House rankings to determine which countries should be members of the Council or not. And they're not going to agree with anybody else's rankings either. But it's the body that we have. And I really don't think it is fundamentally structurally flawed. It just needs a lot of work to get it to do the right thing. I also think, look, that the elections, they're secret ballots. There is no reason why countries with poor human rights records need to get elected to the Council. There's absolutely no reason. Even in non-competitive slates, when there's no one else running, members of the GA can still vote no. They could still reject a country and it wouldn't get elected to a seat. So partly there's a lot of work to be done in terms of changing the general mindset at the UN, but that's a very typical UN mindset. We go along with the countries your group has put forward, and you go along with the countries that we put forward. That's a reality at the UN, and it's going to be reality within any kind of mechanism that's established.
Do you want to comment?
Indeed. Well, I guess my major lament about where history has brought us in UN matters is the same as George Washington discovering political parties, and being upset that people were no longer patriot kings, but instead voted according to being Republicans or monocrats, which is that the regional organization system and then the now quite archaic division of the world into the G77, which is the group of 77. Only it's the group of 132, so it's the group of 2/3, so it's the General Assembly. This stems from the Cold War. It stems from a much earlier period of economic difference in view between North and South, and yet it has embedded itself. These exclusive, closed caucuses have embedded themselves in the political structure, the procedural structure of the UN. As I like to tell my students, when I was bored one day in the UN basement, I thought I'd go to the G77 meeting on the continental shelf just to see what was going on. I was surprised I couldn't go because it was closed, because it was a regional caucus. So if you're hoping for a Habermasian philosophical I-thou engagement and conversation, you can't have it necessarily. It's run with a series of closed caucuses. If I could there was one Finnish tip I once found who held the same view. If I could bust that up and have just much more mix and match, I think it'd be a much healthier place. If only by a norm of generally encouraging, if not demanding, open meetings. Now people say, what if the P2 met in the British ambassador's dining room? There are limits, I guess. But for major meetings to not be accessible even to observers from elsewhere is very derisory of the politics. Now, where I disagree, I guess, with the way that the Council was given birth was two things. One is that extravagant promises were made for it. And again, many of these are my dear friends, and I've been wrong so many times in my life that I can't begin to count. But anybody who supposed that the elections were, as Human Rights Watch supposed, that the elections were going to come out different because you didn't have slate voting, you had contested voting. Well, honey, the same regional organizations set up the preferred voting pattern. So that didn't do very good. I do worry that we used up our one chance to reform the place. You can't burn down the house every 3 years or 5 years. And major architectural reforms come really only once a generation. So there was a hurry to get this done that back when, which I don't fully understand. Jan Eliasson, the wonderful Swedish diplomat, was president of the General Assembly at the time. He was going home to Sweden. We all like to have achievements. I wouldn't have pushed it quickly. I do think there at times can be a kind of a wish fulfillment that deludes all of us, but including leaders of NGOs and people who want to believe in the UN. Now, as to what you could do now, who could be against more inclusiveness? So apart from the fact that there's apparently no room big enough in Geneva to seat everybody, well, we could get jump seats and bring in checker cabs. I would just dilute the council, make it everybody, like the GA. Who could be against that? 70. How many people are there on the council now? But more is better. It's easy to sell that meme, and that would give the West somewhat more influence, I think. And I've heard at least one senior person in Pally Wilson in the High Commissioner's office take the same view, a very hard-headed person, take the same view that expanding it, making it more inclusive might actually, strangely enough, improve its disposition. I wish we were better also at kind of military ambush, time-phase deployment plans, if I may use a military metaphor. The Cubans are still lining people up at 5 o'clock in the morning to use up all the speaking opportunities at UPR. We should beat them at that game. We need tacticians who have the resources and the cojones and the desire to just get stuff done. Because the Cubans, they still know how to call the shot. So I guess the one thing that being in Geneva persuaded me of is that if you are on your toes and enjoy the game, every once in a while God lets something drift downstream. You open your mouth and you're a frog and you eat it. And those opportunities are there, but only if you have staff serving in Geneva at the U.S. mission long enough to develop relationships, make this a preferred career track, only if you have ambassadors who are versed in the game, rather than punching a ticket to get there, only if we are just as adept and agile and savvy as some of our less intriguing and amiable interlocutors are. And finally, I guess I've been fooling around a little bit on this Ashraf issue. I'll just use it as a case study. I would wish that the semaphone qualities of the high commissioners be used more for prevention than lamentation. There are lots of opportunities where a well-placed statement, whether it's by the 38th floor or by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, can have great effect. And what you discover is that the politics of the UN are not only complicated at the voting level, but the composition of staff. A particular person in a particular position who has sympathy for a particular country will often be the bottle stop that prevents something from being done. And only an extremely adept pathfinder can find their way through it. So I would, I suppose, urge high commissioners to understand in a more responsible way that they have a preventive function, and waiting till things happen as opposed to preventing them from happening is not what they're about. They should prevent and not lament, and act in time. And that is the semaphone. They have a huge public presence, and I'm not sure. Gutierrez has been very good, but I'm not sure that all of them understand that they really have this kind of Ralph Nader gadfly capability if they choose to use it.
Thank you. Let's get any questions from the floor. If speakers could just identify themselves, and there's a microphone that'll come around. Tanya, this first question, this gentleman, and then Allison will get it from the other side.
My name is Ellen Mendelson. I spent a lot of years.
Hang on one second. It's on the webcast, so just let's try to amplify it.
My name is Alan Mendelson. I spent a lot of years in the State Department. I'm now in the private practice of law, and I also teach international law, various aspects at Georgetown Law School. Among the people that I discuss this issue with, and, not everybody's expert, but among those that I do and who are aware of it, I think they're pretty far beyond all four of you at the table. They not only think that the United States should leave the Council, but they think that the Council ought to be defunded. They think that the Council ought to be, in Miss Wedgwood's words, voluntarily funded. In other words, if the Russians want to pay and the Chinese want to pay, well, let them pay. But you won't have the dignity of the United States involved in that payment, and you won't have the dignity of the United States involved in, 25 resolutions against Israel out of the 40 resolutions that they make. Now, my question to you is there any way in which, and I was asked to ask this question question because nobody knows, is there any way by which this could be spun off from the UN budget so that it would become voluntarily funded, and then nations that wanted this council could pay for it, and thus save the United States one heck of a lot of money in our own financial crisis that we are in right now? Thank you.
Well, the short answer is yes. I mean, the GA can establish through a resolution, establish an independent body like it did with UNICEF or with UNDP, and those organizations are voluntarily funded to the most part. Sometimes they receive funding through the UN regular budget, but generally it's not very much. But I would go one step further and say that a lot of what is funded through the UN regular budget should be spun off into voluntary. You have U.S. or regular budget funding for UNEP, for UNICEF, for what's that? UNRWA, and other organizations that receive the bulk of their funds voluntarily.
And 22% for the United States.
Yeah, 22. And so why wouldn't, if you receive 90+% of your funding voluntarily, why do you have these remnants in the regular budget? And I think it's silly, and severing that link would be a way to have a little bit more responsiveness and independence by those agencies, and they'll have to float and earn money and contributions based on their merits. And I in the council, it's not a lot of money in terms of the regular budget. It's actually a fairly small amount. But I agree with you on principle. If this is an objectionable institution, then the U.S. shouldn't be required to pay for it through the regular budget. It should have an independent funding stream. But I mean, maybe I misrepresented. I don't think that I support the U.S. continuing to be a part of the UN Human Rights Council. I don't know if anybody was confused about that.
I wasn't.
But in terms of that, I think even if you can't withhold directly from it because it doesn't have its own independent budget stream, it's funded through the UN regular budget. I think it's important symbolically. If you decide not to participate in the body and you decide that it's not worthy of U.S. participation, that you should also cut symbolically the proportion of U.S. contributions to it. I think that sends an important signal.
It sends a message that we don't take our treaty obligations seriously. We ratified a treaty which requires the member states to pay the dues which is established by the organization.
The treaty
this treaty probably never would have been ratified in the current climate, but it is a treaty that we're committed to.
The treaty says that the expenses of the organization shall be borne in a manner determined by the member states. The member states could vote that the U.S. has to pay 100% of the expenses of the organization. Does that mean that we are treaty bound to do that? Would that be acceptable? Would that be morally
no, of course
acceptable
not,
to the United States?
But it's
I mean, if the point is, the U.S. has an opportunity to advocate within the organization for a change in how the budget is allocated, and it does so.
And we have done that, and we've gone as far as we can go, but we will not get a majority to support us with the notion that people pick and choose. And in fact, we will suffer from that because other people will pick and choose things that we don't like. And I come back again to the special rapporteurs. If we leave the Human Rights Council and leave its budget and make it a voluntary organization, I assure you the special rapporteurs will disappear. It is even, I think, possible that the Human Rights Council would disappear. The notion that the Russians and the Chinese and the Algerians love the council, I think, is wrong. They go there and fight because they don't want things to happen that they think are bad. But the notion that if we went away in a way that took our money away, that the council would then be funded by these other people, I think is not right. And what would not be funded that would make an enormous difference are the special rapporteurs and are the resolutions of the council about countries where there is repression, which are desired, sought, and felt to be enormously important by the people in those countries. That is the argument that seems to me we have not heard an answer to.
I'll answer that.
Do you think it's not true that people in Belarus and Cuba want council resolutions and that they feel that they help them?
No.
And isn't that worth it?
What I'm saying in response to that is that the Third Committee also passes resolutions that condemn countries, and it does so every year. And those resolutions could be easily applied to other countries. The fact that or the notion that you couldn't get a resolution through the Third Committee on the Ivory Coast or Guinea or Kyrgyzstan when those governments themselves are supporting the resolution, I think is ludicrous. And the fact that, yes, okay, it will be tough to line up votes for some resolutions in the third committee, but guess what? The U.S. lines up votes on a number of different resolutions that are very tough in the General Assembly, in the fifth committee, in the second committee, and other committees as well. So, I mean, the idea that that it's tough isn't alien to the U.S. mission. And the fact that the U.S. faces challenges on getting votes on any number of issues in the General Assembly and or any of the committees is not unusual either.
Can I just jump in? I don't understand why you think that if all of these issues were put to the third committee that we'd have this better outcome. It is the same breakdown, and it is roughly the same percentages as the breakdown of the overall General Assembly. So, I mean, to me, this idea of just taking away our marbles and going home because we don't like certain things that the Council does completely ignores what is at the heart of multilateralism. You don't always win on every issue, and just as if you don't get a bill that you want through Congress, you don't then say, I'm going to drop out of Congress, I'm not going to play the political game anymore because the guys I don't like are winning some of these arguments. You're going to run into that same issue at the full GA and at the third committee as you're fighting at the Council. You can debate funding levels. Should the U.S. be giving as much of the budget of the UN as it does? I think that that's a valid discussion. But to say that we need to break off these little pieces and cut funding for the Council, which is already a really, really small part, I think most human rights organizations and most human rights victims who want the Council to be speaking out on their behalf would rather see a larger budget for the Council so that things like the Special Rapporteurs, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, would have more funding to be able to do the kind of work that they do that is highlighted and supported then by the political body that is the Council. So I just don't get this argument.
Okay, we've heard. Thank you, sir. Ruth's been waiting patiently to make a comment. And
I guess my vain attempt to square the circle, quoting W.C. Fields, is it who said, not only do I believe it in theory, but I've seen it done. Who is that? I'm misquoting whoever it was. Who could be against Nancy Kassebaum, daughter of Alf Land and the saint of hopeless causes, running for president every 4 years for how many decades? When we wanted an inspector general for the UN, I used to be a purist on this subject. I was raised in New York. But when we wanted an inspector general for the UN, Nancy Kassebaum said, I'm not going to let the budget go through until you give me an inspector general. And we got one eventually. So it can be done. It does have a reputational cost, I agree. I think a funny combination of both. Flood them with specific money for particular gifts, voluntary funding. We want a special rapporteur on Cuba, and here's $25 million. We want a special rapporteur on Belarus, and here's a $30 million allocated fund you can't spend for nothing else. Give the High Commissioner money to give out with these special line item expenditures, if you will. But I do think that if the argument of automaticity that we owe the UN support for everything it does, I'm a generally law-abiding person, but I jaywalk once in a while. Expect not to get caught. And this kind of civil disobedience has been used at times to good effect in the past. Because once they take, as any lover knows, once they take you for granted, they don't treat you right. So I would combine my approach.
Can you hold your thought, or do you want to just respond?
I just want to respond to what this is not expectation of better. This is a realization that it's the same. And so if you have two bodies that are roughly the same in terms of composition, in terms of likely results, why do you need two?
But the hard question, Brett, is if the game really changed to the third committee, all the quarterbacks and heavyweight linebackers would go to the third committee and try to work the same.
Of course they would. Of course they would, and you would have the same dynamic, but at least you wouldn't have two duplicative bodies essentially doing the exact same thing. And you could do it in New York, where every country is represented, rather than Geneva, where a number of countries aren't. And you could also do it in a place where, arguably, the U.S. already has people in place to make a number of different decisions and trade-offs that are unrelated to just this issue, and you can maybe expand your influence through that matter.
Okay. Let's move on. The gentleman has a question there, and then that one.
Thanks. I'm Ed Almodóvar from the UN Association. A comment and a question. First of all, a comment is to look at this in a longer historical context. In the 1960s, I worked on human rights at the U.S. mission to the UN, including on the famous periodic reports on human rights. And compared to what we have now, then it was completely pathetic. There were all sorts of things one can criticize with what exists now, but then there was virtually nothing. And the spoilers we see now were virtually universal. So I think if we see it in a longer context, there has been important progress. To suggest that we've got nirvana or anywhere near nirvana is ridiculous. Now, the question is, can we look at this in terms of complements rather than alternatives to the Human Rights Council? Can we look further at independent mechanisms, go beyond the special rapporteurs with new forms of independent experts, new forms of support to NGOs, whether they are Ruth Redwood's independent NGOs, special budgets for NGOs, whatever it may be. I'd like the panel to expand a little bit on what opportunities they would see in this area.
Okay,
thanks.
And we'll take one last question. The gentleman there has been waiting, and then we'll give our panelists one final opportunity to respond and anything else on their mind.
Aloha, I'm Joshua Cooper from University of Hawaii and also the director of the Four Freedoms Forum, and it's an honor to be here this week. I'd just like to make a comment. I think the approach that Ed was taking is actually the right one. If you look at it in the decades approach, it's really only been around since 60 years, since Eleanor Roosevelt was chairing the Commission on Human Rights and what we've accomplished. And the truth is, the reason the Human Rights Council is weak now is because of the drunken disconnect in diplomacy that the U.S. had during the previous administration. That was the problem. We were trying to cut positions there. And instead of having the 53 that we had, we tried to bring it down to 47. We lost the significant votes by not engaging the whole time. And now we have the current structure of the Human Rights Council that favors those states you don't like, who supposedly don't play along as they should. And so that is the problem, is that we haven't been connected, and we weren't doing that. And I would say after being there for the entire process, I was fortunate enough to cover the entire transition of the whole thing of the reforming the UN. That was the only thing that really did get reformed, was the Human Rights Council. The other aspects, like Security Council, didn't, because we didn't want other people to have permanent seats, who would have paid more for the budget. It's a question of how many people are really there on the ground to participate.
Thank you. Yeah.
One last thing really quick on the UPR is we did have success. It was the U.S. NGOs that went to Geneva that got those recommendations. It was 228, by the way, not 280.
I'm going by UPR Info, which is the
I work with
the
UPR
website.
Info in Geneva. It's 228.
No, the website's at 280 this morning. I went through the report and I did the numbers.
It's 228. I'm just trying to tell you to get the facts straight. So it's 228, but they were all written by U.S. NGOs, getting the points there to the governments.
Yeah.
And it was the U.S. NGOs that did win by waking up early and riding bicycles to get in to ask our questions, instead of the governments that stayed up late serving coffee. So you can win when you do participate, and we can develop indigenous knowledge that improves the UN system. We just need to support it and actually be there. So for the people who say they've never been there, that's the problem. And I'd ask if you've been at it as well, because if you've been there, I think you'd have a different perspective. So if you have, I think it's great. I just haven't seen you there. Thank you.
Great. Let's give the panel final opportunity to comment on the questions and anything else in their mind. Mort, do you have a final thought?
Yeah, a couple of things. One, I think we do need to be more imaginative. I very much endorse the notion of target funding for good rapporteurs. There's no reason why we can't do that. I think the administration has been very creative in breaking what I think is the world's great evil, which is the regional and ideological blocks in the UN and the Human Rights Council, by going to countries and breaking them off. So we got the religion by going to Egypt. We got the new resolution on freedom of association by going to Indonesia. Indonesia said it didn't like country resolutions, so we went to them and said, all right, what about freedom of association? So the resolution came to the Council as an Indonesian-American resolution. It ended, you therefore couldn't get the Islamic bloc against it, you couldn't get the Asian bloc against it. Incidentally, Israel should be in the Asian bloc, should not have to be begging to be sandwiched into something else. And I think the UN will not be, in my view, a real organization until if they have a regional bloc, the countries in the region can be in the bloc. But I think there are other ways to be imaginative. I think we should try to use the third committee in more imaginative ways. I see it as complementary to the Council, but something that can play an important an important role in the process. And we should use the Security Council more. And we've been trying to do that. And of course, the Security Council has now done its second referral to the International Criminal Court. And people do notice that, especially people who don't want to be referred to the court.
Thanks. Brett?
Sure. To talk to you about the UPR info. If you, my paper, I did have 228 down, and I went through the U.S. report and counted them up and listed 228 in my paper. I went to UPR info yesterday to look at that again, and their number on the list of total recommendations had the U.S. at 280. Maybe it's changed. I was there yesterday, so I'm not sure why that's different. In terms of the voluntary support of special rapporteurs, I think that's actually a good idea. I think the United States should be willing to support voluntary funding for various human rights offices and various human rights experts. I think that's a great idea. And I think that they would be more responsive. I think that they would be more independent and willing to fulfill their mandates, and also probably more capable of fulfilling their mandates with more resources. I don't think that getting rid of the Human Rights Council and going to third committee spells a death knell for the independent experts. I don't think that that is the case at all. I think that it could just as easily, that authority could be shifted over to the High Commissioner, and they could carry out the appointments of the independent experts at the recommendation of the third committee. There's no reason why this couldn't happen. The notion that this is how it is and therefore this is how it always must be is I think a little bit unrealistic. And in terms of the quality of the special rapporteurs and the independent experts, they vary. Some of them are quite good. Some of them are not quite so good. The U.S. administration has criticized Richard Falk several different times for anti-Semitic statements, and John Ziegler was the person who established the Muammar Gaddafi Prize for Human Rights, I think it was. So there are independent experts that have less than stellar qualifications as well. So you just take it for what it is, and if the third committee appoints less than qualified experts, that's simply a situation that also exists with the Human Rights Council as well. I'll just, I guess, close up with this notion that somehow there's an opportunity to improve the Human Rights Council. That opportunity was with the mandatory review. And the recommendations that were made by the United States, the U.S. made over two dozen different recommendations, and other countries made a number of other recommendations as well. And for the most part, they were just rejected. There are a few minor tweaks to the UPR process, but not anything significant that is going to fundamentally change the way it works. And there is an opportunity to revisit that, I think, in 10 years. But what is the likelihood of that happening if we didn't get it right now? I think the council that we have is the council that we're going to have. And that is not going to change. And I think that the member states are getting smarter in how they're offering candidates. They're increasingly relying on clean slates, offering the same number of candidates as there are open slots. And they realize that if they present a clean slate to the General Assembly, more than likely they're going to get that slate elected. The critical point there was to have competitive elections, but again, that was rejected by the member states. I think what we have is what we're going to have, and I think it's a disappointment. And I don't think that having two disappointing bodies is necessarily better than having one disappointing body. And so that's the basis for my skepticism about working through the Human Rights Council. And I think that the third committee could easily assume that the various responsibilities if they chose.
Thank you. Paula?
Sure. I would say I agree that the council is just one piece of the bigger human rights mechanism that makes up the UN system. I think obviously the treaty bodies are essentially expert bodies, so you've got that there. The system of special rapporteurs and mandates are independent experts. I think there's actually a very small handful of them that are quite poor. When you look at the main experts that focus at least on the issues that Freedom House emphasizes, which are the core political rights and civil liberties, the mandate holders have by and large been quite strong. And it's a system that should be supported more. Whether individual contributions to specific mandates will work or could potentially backfire, I think, is room for a larger discussion, because there are other wealthy countries, of course, who would fund certain special rapporteurs that we might not like as well. So I think we kind of want to, I'd like to think that one through a little bit before saying, I do like the idea of giving the good special rapporteurs more resources, but I think it could be more complex, sort of like creating the Human Rights Council. Everybody thought if you just create the new system that it's going to work perfectly, but whenever you open up, a can of worms at a big bureaucratic body like that, it turns out that it never ends up being as easy as you thought it would. So sometimes getting what you want is not always the best thing. I would say absolutely your point about supporting alternative voices and creating funds for other human rights organizations and indigenous groups is absolutely critical. It's frankly the main thing that Freedom House uses its ECOSOC status for, is to bring human rights defenders from other organizations to the council so that they can directly interact with the member states, with the special rapporteurs, with the media, and all of those other NGOs that are based there in Geneva. Absolutely, without our doing that, and without a couple of other organizations like the Democracy Coalition Project and some others that do that, there's no question that there would be a real lack of those voices, those non-Western voices at the Council. And what's so critical about it, again, is to fight back against this assertion that a lot of these core and fundamental freedoms are Western creations. Of course, that's absolutely not true. It's only governments who say that. Whenever you get the citizens of the countries, they know full and well that they have those same four core fundamental rights as everybody else. So I absolutely support. There's the UN Democracy Fund, which exists now. It's one of the few successes, I would say, actually, of the community of democracy. Is one of the few things that I can say substantively has come out of that, and it has succeeded in giving some good funding to non-Western, if you will, human rights organizations, and it's also provided funds to other groups to do the kind of things like bring those human rights defenders to Geneva to make an impact there. So.
Ruth.
Well, I guess we come away from today with at least one general consensus position that we all believe in targeted funding for special rapporteurs. So I hope we can adopt that by consensus. And I'll tell you, currently, the rapporteurs I know are lucky if they can do one mission a year. And they're typically academics, so they have lots of leisure time. So if you could let them do 2 or 3 or 4 with a suggestion as to what possibly might be worthwhile, that would be a very penurious and effective kind of targeted funding. It doesn't cost a lot to do a mission. So 100K here, 200K there, and you could have quite a different product, I think, than what you currently have. Would do the same thing with the High Commissioner's Office, too. And meet the worry that, for example, if there's too much capacity building in her allocation of funds, that you may, in fact, destroy and denude the treaty bodies. Just general thought, when you think through the architecture of the human rights monitoring system in general, Europe is pretty well provided for. The European Commission, or the court rather, does most everything, and the OSCE, the High Commissioner for National Minorities. So there, the UN apparatus, with due respect for the neglect of the Roma and the rather how shall we say, bullying quality of European countries to many of the third world people they deport. But in general, except for those two things, and the Jews, of course, but the European system works pretty well. I do think the UN should spend more time thinking about how it allocates its attention to the regions that don't yet have effective mechanisms. So Latin America, Europe, generally okay, sort of. Africa, Asia, a great desert. The mutual deference of African heads of state toward each other. Mandela goes to visit Gaddafi. No one to not pay your debts. And in Asia, the ASEAN system is just beginning to stand up its commission, but there too I think you may expect a certain kind of mutual head of state deference. So there I think would be a good place if you are writing a check to do targeted funding for missions that are concentrating on Africa and Asia, not to make them feel that they're being colonized once again, but just to say that they should have the same degree of scrutiny that the Americas and Europe has.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you all for attending today, and please join me in thanking, this has been a rich discussion. Please join me in thanking our speakers.